All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to our week 7 presentation. We're going to talk about several things, so it might be a longer presentation than other weeks. Kind of go back and forth on that. But welcome. This week, we're going to talk about plagiarism and finding the best sources for your work, because we are going toward the compare and contrast essay, which I've asked you to start adding source material in, at least one for this upcoming paper, but we will continue to add source material with the next 3 papers. So we're going to talk about adding source material, finding the best sources, especially looking online. We're going to use what I like to call the sandwiching method in a couple different areas, both with adding sources and the entire essay. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, I do want to talk about plagiarism, and you might notice that at the bottom of this presentation we'll be using APA citation, but we're going to talk about MLA as well. So you could just see that the citation looks a little different. But so plagiarism, what is this? So before you build your sandwich, you first have to find the right ingredients. So plagiarism is the act of presenting words, ideas, images, sounds, or the creative expression of others as your own. It's a pretty wide definition. Someone's ideas, you're presenting their ideas as your own. That can be rather tricky to solidify in terms of, okay, you're plagiarizing or not, but it's a broad topic, but it's definitely something we want to avoid. So this is a study about high school students. So a study of almost 4,500 students at 25 schools suggests cheating is a significant problem in high school. 74% of respondents admitted to one or more instances of serious test cheating, and 72% admitted to serious cheating on written assignments. Over half of the students admitted they had engaged in some level of plagiarism on written assignments using the internet. And that was in 2003. So just imagine how far we've come in our abilities to search the internet for information. So yes, plagiarism is definitely rampant in high schools, and I think a lot of that has to do with just not understanding what it is or how to approach source material. So I'm not just saying, high school students are a bunch of cheaters. But a lot of times people do things unintentionally. So I think it's important to understand the 2 types of plagiarism, intentional and unintentional. So oftentimes the thing that we would categorize ourselves in is the unintentional side. But of course, people do plagiarize intentionally. That could be if you copy someone else's work. Perhaps someone that took this class last year and you're borrowing their papers. That would be copying their work. Borrowing or buying papers. There's a lot of websites that you can buy essays from. Cutting and pasting blocks of text from electronic sources without documenting. That happens probably the most, although some people don't understand how to effectively copy and paste and cite sources well. So that's something we'll be working on. Borrowing media without documentation. Media happens a lot with like images, videos, that kind of stuff. Or web publishing without permission from the creators. That happens a lot as well. Not so much in the high school realm, but just in general. Unintentional plagiarism can include things like careless paraphrasing. A lot of times students will just change a word or two from a sentence that is from a source and call that paraphrasing, and that's really not what paraphrasing is. Just poor documentation. You're just lazy about it and don't give all the facts that we need. Quoting excessively can be unintentional plagiarism. Although I will say that all of these, including failure to use your own voice, all of those are teachable things. These are things that we can look at and go, okay, so you don't understand how to use source material. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out how to do this right. And that's really where our discussion boards come in, and also just interactions through your essays and things like that. So we definitely want to work on moving away from these unintentional acts of plagiarism. But intentional acts of plagiarism have real life consequences. So I have a couple examples here that I wanted to point out. The first one that I wanted to point out was by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And you might recognize that author as the author of Lincoln. So the movie that was it came out a few years ago about Abraham Lincoln. It was based on a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin. So Kearns left a television position and stepped down as a Pulitzer Prize judge for lifting 50 passages in her 1987 book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys. So she plagiarized in that book and had real life consequences. Another, then Senator Joe Biden, I think you might recognize that name as our current vice president, dropped out of his 1987 campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination because he copied in law school and borrowed from campaign speeches of Robert Kennedy. Now, of course, we can see from both of these that people are able to bounce back from troubling times in terms of plagiarism. But there are real life consequences. I believe there was a student right in Missouri at University of Missouri in Columbia that had her degree revoked for plagiarizing. And it happens all the time. So a lot of people then come up with this question, do I have to cite everything? Because we get nervous about plagiarizing, so then it just becomes the entire paper is cited. But you don't have to cite everything. There are a few exceptions. So, and this comes in the form of common knowledge. So things that are widely known, so facts that are widely known, perhaps that would be, quotes by famous people. Give me liberty or give me death. Okay, so that's a quote that's very well known in the United States. You do not have to cite that one. Or information or judgments considered as common knowledge. This happens, common knowledge is interesting because sometimes common knowledge can be common to everyone, but if you are writing a paper specific toward one particular field of study for a class in that field of study, you might find that common knowledge would be knowledge from courses that you've taken from that field of study and that kind of stuff. So common knowledge in that field would not need to be cited, but if you then took a class in a different field and used the same information that was common knowledge before, it might be helpful to go ahead and cite those things in another field of study. So just keep in mind, things that are widely known or common knowledge do not need to be cited. So I think that it's important when we start to develop. Now I'm done with my speech about plagiarism. You guys know, don't plagiarize. So once you have determined that you are not going to plagiarize, but you do need to integrate sources into your papers, it's important to be able to find the right ingredients. So especially when you have a class that's online like ours, a lot of the research that you're going to do is going to be online. Now, of course, you probably have access to real live libraries, and that's awesome. Crowder has an online library available to students, and there's just a lot of available research online. And I don't say that students can't use the internet. Obviously, we live in the internet, so it's definitely something we can use. You just need to be discerning in the sources that you find. So, for instance, a few years ago, I had some students writing a paper about homelessness in America. So, to help out with finding appropriate sources, I just did a quick Google search for the phrase homelessness in America, and an article popped up. Now, I will say that this website is no longer available, so if you tried to go to it, I wouldn't suggest doing so because there's probably ads and whatever else trying to put stuff on your computer, so don't do that. But this is from a few years ago, and when I went to the website, it was an article that had an author, it had a publication date, it had a title, it had all the stuff that you would need to cite the source. And so it looked like it could be an appropriate source to find. But once reading it, it seemed pretty generalized. There weren't a lot of facts. So I decided to do a little more background check because it was a normal .com kind of website. So this is what the website used to look like. And this is the article itself. We see that at the top there's the title of the entire website, and then we have the web page Homelessness America. You might see that there are ads by Google there on the page, which, not saying that ads are bad, but that can definitely give you a little heads up that maybe you need to double check your sources and making sure that's reliable. The thing that I thought was odd was on the right hand side there was a login and password element, and that seemed different to me. So what I did is I went ahead and I just clicked on the main title for the home page, and it was interesting. What I found was this page, and this is the Article T homepage. What it was then, obviously, like I said, it's no longer available. But if you read through this, it's actually a website that if you join it, anyone can post about anything, and they will publish it as if they were a reputable publisher. So it's kind of like a blog website that doesn't tout itself as a blog. So it makes it appear that these are significant articles when they're actually just topics written by everyday people that have no fact-checking involved. So what we want to do when we're looking for sources, we want to find peer-reviewed, relevant, reputable sources. How do we do that? Well, for one, obviously go to the library. You're going to find source material that's going to be reliable at the library. Printed magazines, journals, encyclopedias, reference books, those kinds of things are all available through your library and through the Crowder Library. So you can definitely utilize those elements. Now, if you wanted to do some research online and want to make sure that you're finding peer-reviewed, reputable sources, one of the things that you can do is a Google Scholar search, which I think is, oops, wrong thing. So if you were to go, we're going to talk about that website in a bit, but you go to, your browser and you can just type in google.com/scholar, and that will take you to a Google site, but it's going to search only peer-reviewed material. So as you can see, it says articles, and then you can search through Google just like you would any other time. And you also have some different elements where you can log in and you could do my citations and my library and save some things. But it's definitely a good way to handle doing some research, because you can rely on it being source material you can use. So it's just important to make sure that you are finding source material that is appropriate for academic research. Once you've found sources, there are 3 different ways that you can include sources into your paper. And they're very similar, but I think it's good to have a variety of source usage in your papers. So you can use things quoting, you can paraphrase, and you can summarize, and each of these are a little bit different. And but I want you to keep in mind that the source material should blend with your own ideas, making sure that your voice is the most important voice in the paper. Sources should not take over your paper. They should be there to back up what you already have to say. So let's look at these each on their own. So quotations are the exact words of an author, copied directly from the source, word for word. So keep in mind that quotations must be cited. So you use quotations when you want to add power to an author's words to support your argument. If you want to disagree with an author, you might share their quote and then show how you disagree. You would, if you want to highlight a particularly eloquent or powerful phrase or passage, that's a good time to quote. If you're comparing and contrasting specific points of view, so this author's point of view versus this author's point of view, you can compare and contrast using quotes. Or if you want to note important research that has preceded your own, you can use quotes. Keep in mind that quotations are direct word-for-word copies from a source. You still have to cite it, and what you need to do is put quotation marks around the citation, whatever the quote is, a quotation mark at the beginning of the quote, quotation mark at the end of the quote, and you need to add in-text citation and a works cited page citation. We're going to look at this more deeply in just a minute, but quoting is one way you can integrate sources. Another way that's very common is paraphrasing, and paraphrasing means that you rephrase the words of an author, putting his or her own thoughts into your own words. So when you paraphrase, you rework the source's ideas, words, phrases, and sentence structures with your own. So it needs to look like your writing, not someone else's. But you need to follow any paraphrase with in-text citation and cited on your works cited page. You have to have citation when you paraphrase. You would paraphrase when you want to share information from your notes and avoid plagiarism. If you want to avoid overusing quotations, you can add paraphrasing in, or if you want to use your own voice to present the same information. And then finally there's summarizing, and this is when you'll use less than any other, I would say, unless you were assigned a particular thing to summarize. But a summary involves putting the main ideas of one or several writers into your own words. So this would include only the main points. Summaries are significantly shorter than the original work, and they take a broad overview of the source material. So keep in mind that just like quoting, just like paraphrasing, summaries also need to have in-text citation and a works cited page citation. Times when you would do this, if you want to establish background information or offer an overview of a topic, this might happen for those of you that have decided to compare and contrast two specific works, like a movie or a book or something, or a story that you have in mind and you want to give an overview of those things. You might use summarizing. If you want to describe knowledge from several sources about a topic, or if you want to determine the main idea of a single source. Now, let's get to sandwiching, right? So if we're going to add source material to our papers, like I mentioned, I don't want your sources to overcome your own voice. Your voice should be the prominent feature of a paper. So when you want to add source material into your paper, what I suggest that you do is use this sandwiching method. So you start with your voice, and that remains the important part of the paper. So you start a sandwich with bread, right? So we have two pieces of bread, and in between is like the meat, or I don't know, if you're vegetarian, maybe a tomato or something. But you always start adding source material with your own words. So the bread is your words. So what you would do when you start to add source material to your paper, you will introduce what is coming. So if it's a quote, you introduce the quote. If it's a paraphrase, you introduce the paraphrase. If it's a summary, you introduce that. So you're introducing what is to come. You're letting the reader know that what is coming next is from a source rather than your own words. This is a great thing, because not only does it allow the source material to transition from your words into the source words, and it flows nicely, but it also helps you avoid plagiarism, because then the reader knows, hey, the stuff that's coming next is from an outside source. So even if you mess up on your citation, the actual mechanics of citation, by introducing that the information is coming from a source, you let people know, hey, I'm not plagiarizing, I'm telling you that this stuff is source material. So it's always good to start by introducing the source material. So this can be done in another number of ways. So I've added some examples here. As one journalist wrote in USA Today, or Jay Stanley of USA Today wrote, or one article from a leading magazine stated. All of these would be great introductions for source material. Some of them are very specific with the author and the publication name. One just has the publication name. One doesn't state either one of those. It just says it's one article from a magazine. So it doesn't have to be terribly specific. It just needs to let the reader know, hey, what's coming next is from a source, right? So then once you add the source once you introduce the source material, you want to then share the source. So in this instance, it's a quote, and we have the fact is airports are high-stress environments. People are running late. They are mad at the airlines or their cab driver or their boss. They're upset because they're going to a funeral, or terrified of flying, or saying goodbye to their lover, or are flying off to start a new life. The idea that the roiling complexity inside our heads can be analyzed through simple external signs is naive and simplistic. End quote. Share the citation, period. So we have the author's last name, Stanley, and then the page number. If you don't have a page, such as an internet source, you wouldn't have a page number. You just put Stanley. But we have a quote with quotation marks at the beginning. Notice the quotation mark at the end, citation, and then the period at the end of the sentence. So when you share a quote, you need to include those things as well. So we had an introductory element, then we share the meat or the tomato of the sandwich, which is the actual source material, and then we move on to the last piece of bread, which is your words again. So you relate that quote back to your own ideas. You explain it, you analyze it, you let the reader know what you're thinking. Why would you share that quote in the first place? So here is an example with this quote, as Stanley exemplified. So I'm referring back to the quote. So I'm letting people know, hey, I'm talking about the quote again. As Stanley exemplified, determining a person's dubious nature due to emotional state is nearly impossible. Profiling might be the answer. So here it's giving a point of view about a topic. It's relating the quote to that point of view. So let's look at this in a couple other ways. So I have mentioned before that I did a presentation on Jane Austen recently and comparing the book Pride and Prejudice to the many films. So when I was doing research, I also wanted to integrate source material into my presentation. So I found a lot of different research, and this is what I came up with. So here I have a quote from an author named Catherine Sutherland, and I wanted to show you something that I'm missing, but I wanted to show you the sandwich that I used, and then we're going to fix the quote. So this says, literary critic Sutherland put it this way. So here I have an introductory element. I'm letting you know the person that said this was a literary critic. This is the person's name, Sutherland, and this is what they said. So I'm introducing what's going to happen. And then, quote, Jane Austen was doing something new with the novel, comma, she was describing probable reality and the kinds of people one felt one already knew, end quotation. Her characters are reflective of the human condition. They are relatable, but they are also fallible and real. So here in this sandwich, I did include an introductory element. I did include a quote, and then I related the quote to my point of view. What I didn't do is add the in-text citation. So you notice that my quote ends with no in-text citation. So I've added at the bottom the works cited page citation. And this follows the basic structure of a works cited page. So we have the author's name, we have the article title, we have the publication title, we have any other publication information like the publisher. If for a website, you're going to include the date that it was published, that it was a website, the date that you found the quote, and then the URL if you choose. You don't have to always include the URL. It's optional with MLA. So I want to add in-text citation. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove that period at the end of the quote because it needs to come after the citation. Anytime you use a quote or paraphrase or summary, you have to follow it by in-text citation. That's going to come in parentheses, and the first thing you're going to include is the last name of the author. So this particular article only has one author, and it's Sutherland, and I'm putting that in a parentheses. And then you would share the page number if there are any. Now, on a web page, there aren't page numbers generally, and there wasn't one for this. So I'm just going to leave that completely out. I end the parentheses and I put a period at the end. And that's it. That's all that's required for in-text citation. If I didn't have an author's name, then I would use the title of the work, so Jane Austen, Social Realism, and the novel. So I would use that instead of an author. And if I did have a page number, it would just be a space after the last name of the author and then the page number, and that's what that would look like. So let's do another one. Several students have mentioned that they want to write a comparison between different books or a film and a book, and I think that's a great idea. I like it. So I went and did some research. I found this website called shortlist.com, and it has an article called Books versus Films, the infographic. I thought this was kind of a cool article. I read it, and it has some neat things to say. So if I were writing a paper about a book versus a film, I might use this article. One of the things that I would do, as you see I'm scrolling through here, is I'm going to start looking for the information that I need to cite the source. A lot of times if you go all the way down to the bottom, you'll get some of that publication information. So here it's copyrighted 2010-2015, so that's a date that we can use. And I'm looking for an author, and I really don't see an author, but I do see via visually. And we do see a page number here. This is on page 3. So we do see a page number. Maybe if I go to page 1. So sometimes you have to kind of look around. Oh, I see. It's not a page number. This is an image that is transitioning. So we don't have a page number. So it's good to kind of look at your website. For the purposes of a film kind of review, I think that you can be a little less discerning on the type of source. So like, just because you have a lot of information about movies online. So I don't know who this Visual Lee is, so I'm going to click on that and see if I can get any more information. Okay, so this is a website that they got the graph from, so it's not the author. So it's good to kind of look through a website to see what kind of information you can find about the source. And I'm just scrolling through, and I just don't see an author mentioned. And it's okay to not have an author when we look at this information. So let's go from here. So we have the title of the web page, we have the title of the article, and then we have a date. So let's go from here. So I'm going to actually pull this very first line as a quote because I think it's pretty cool. We're going to be bold. Films will never ever be a patch on the power of the imagination filtered through the pages of a book. So we're going to use that quote. Come back to my document. And I'm just going to stick it in here. There's a quote. Fix my margins for now. So I have a quote. I think it's pretty cool. Got it from a website. And I'm going to build a sandwich. I'm going to add citation. So the first thing we're going to do is start the sandwich. We're going to introduce the quote. So we can say one film critic website mentioned. And I'm just going to use that as my is my introductory element. So I'm starting my sandwich, one film critic website mentioned, and then I put a comma and start the quotation. And then at the end of the quote, I want to add citation, but I'm going to do that in a minute after I come up with my works cited page citation. So then at the end of the quote, I want to bring it back to my main idea. So if I were going to compare and contrast the Divergent books with the Divergent movies, I might bring this quote back. So I might say, let me think. So I might write, though the Divergent films have box office acclaim, as this source mentions, those films cannot hold a candle to the books. So with this ending, this last piece of bread, what I do is I bring it back to my topic. So I bring it back to my comparison of the Divergent books with the movie, and I also address that quote. So as the source mentions, though the Divergent films have box office acclaim, those films cannot hold a candle to the book. So it's kind of analyzing the quote while also bringing back the main topic of my paper. So we sandwiched the quote with our own words. Now, we want to add citation. So I like, when I add a source to my paper, I always like to build the citation right away so I don't forget. That's another thing when you're trying to avoid plagiarism. Build your citations right away. You won't forget to include them because they're already built. So as I mentioned before, we don't have an author. So we're just going to leave that out. With MLA citation, you just leave it empty. So for this source, we want to start with the title, Books versus Films, the infographic. So we're going to go back to here, put in quotation marks, Books versus Films, the infographic. That's the title of the article. Then we're going to go look for the title of the web page. I'm going to scroll up a little bit, and it's called shortlist.com. It's a magazine. So we will put that in italics. And then we need to find some publisher information. So who publishes this website? And I'm going to just scroll all the way down to the end of the page because that can also help us. So we look at who is here. It's copyrighted by Shortlist. So this tells us that Shortlist is its own publisher. It doesn't have a backing of any sort, so it's just Shortlist. So we don't need to include any other publication information. We did see that it was copyrighted 2010 to 2015, so we use the most recent copyright date. We're going to write that it's a web page, that's where we found it, and then the date that we accessed it, so that's today. The date, then the month, then the year, and then we include the URL in these little brackets. So I'm going to go over and get that URL up here. I'm just going to copy that, paste that into my web page, my Word document, and end the bracket. I'm just going to fix the formatting here. So in a works cited page, we have a hanging indent, so I'm just moving the indents to correct that and make sure that the fonts are all the same. And there you go. So I have a works cited page reference there, and then I can add the in-text citation once I have that built. So the in-text citation will just be the title of the work because we don't have We don't have an author. So notice there's still quotation marks around it because it's an article title, and then we have the end of the parentheses and a period at the end. So that's how we would sandwich a website into a paper. So let's talk about sandwiching. This is putting that last one all together, sorry. Let's talk about sandwiching the essay. So here we had sandwiching sources. We're integrating source material into our own writing. But we're also developing some academic essays here. We're starting with our compare and contrast that are more formal than our previous essays. So when we create these more formal papers, we need to be able to sandwich the meat of our analysis, of our compare and contrast, with a clear introductory paragraph and a clear conclusion paragraph. And introductions or conclusions can be the most difficult parts of a paper to write. Unless you're weird like me, and I really like to write them. But I'm also kind of nerdy and like to write anyway, so that's just how that goes. But now, while the body of the paper can tend to be easier to write because it's just basically presenting point, information, things from your research and all that stuff, it does need a frame around it. So an introduction and conclusion can frame your thoughts and bridge your ideas for the reader. So an introductory paragraph is the very first paragraph of your paper, and it's the first impression that you give your readers. It's, you know, kind of like that handshake. Did you have a smile on your face? Is your grip firm? It's that first impression that you get to the reader. It makes them want to read your paper, and it's also that roadmap for the rest of the paper. So it's going to include a few things. The introduction is going to include the attention grabber, how you're going to hook your reader's attention. It's going to include any background information that you need to share. So for instance, if you were comparing a film and a book, you might give a summary of the story right there in that introductory paragraph. And it's going to include your thesis statement, which we've already talked about thesis statements in this class. But those are the three things that are going to be in your introduction. So I have an example introduction. And this is from a paper about imagination and using imagination in writing. When I was a child, I often got chided for daydreaming in school. It wasn't when I had work to do, but after I completed anything I needed for homework, I would sit at my desk and dream up stories. In kindergarten, I tried to think of what it would be like if the old gnarled oak tree that spread its branches out like waiting arms on the west side of the playground were to really come alive. Even as I grew older and more sociable, my parents could still hear me creating fanciful plots aloud in the seemingly private confines of my bedroom. Imagination was something I had no problem generating in my writing. In fact, it seemed to be a natural part of my psyche. However, this is not so with all of those trying to practice good writing, and natural talent or tendency toward imaginative processes is not the end-all and be-all of using one's imagination. Activating the imagination does not have to be reserved for the elite born with Shakespeare tattooed on his forehead writer. Writing well is available to anyone willing to take the time to think about the why. Imagination is really for those that are ready to explore. So in this paragraph, I have those three elements I talked about. I have an attention grabber, I have background information, I have a thesis statement. My thesis is underlined, so it's right there. It is more of an implied thesis than an explicit thesis statement, but it's definitely the thesis. It's what's going to drive the rest of the paper. But my attention grabber, I used vivid details like the old gnarled oak that spread its branches out like waiting arms on the west side of the playground to draw the reader into the story. I also used personal experience, which this would be a time when first-person perspective would be okay in an academic paper because it's being used to grab the reader's attention and as a narrative structure. So I'm not just saying I think that writing with imagination is easy. No, I'm using first-person perspective as a form of evidence in the paper. So I hook the reader's attention with that narrative element, and then I add some background information. So I connect the thesis statement to the narrative by talking about how imagination does not have to be something that is natural. It's something that can be developed. And so I bring up that idea, and then I move into my thesis statement. So once you have created a hook. You want to move into that thesis statement. Like I mentioned earlier, you can use implied, like the one in the previous example, and that can be used. I'd prefer for our first academic paper, first compare and contrast, to have it more explicit, which is where it's definitely telling you what the topic of the paper is, like we talked about thesis statements earlier. But the hook can come in a variety of ways. You don't just have to share a narrative. You can do many things. So you can share a startling statistic. You can provide an interesting quote from your source material. You can ask questions of the reader and answer them, or leave the answers until the conclusion. You can do a number of things to grab the reader's attention. But that first element of the introduction should somehow get the reader to want to read the rest of your paper. And then you move into background information and finally the thesis statement. Now the last paragraph of your paper is going to be what's called the conclusion of your paper. And this is where you have the final say on the issues that you have raised in your paper. So you're going to summarize your thoughts, demonstrate the importance of your ideas, and propel your reader to a new view of the subject. It's also your opportunity to make a final good impression, to end on a positive note, or at least a thought-provoking note. Not all the time do we end with positivity in our essays, but it definitely can end where we are thinking about your topic still. So this is the conclusion of the introductory paragraph I shared earlier. Ultimately, in fiction and nonfiction writing, it all starts with an idea. It is the writer's responsibility to pursue that idea or not. And that is where imagination comes in. Imagination is not genetic or necessarily a gift from above. Imagination is the willingness and the drive to follow after questions. What if communism took over the world? Why did women in the 60s feel it was necessary to keep curlers in their hair at all hours of the day? What if Mr. Darcy really loved Elizabeth? What if? Why? These are questions that spur on the imagination. So from this paragraph, you can see that I not only sum up the contents of my essay, which you didn't see the rest of the essay, but I did talk about these questions that are at the end, but I also bring back the imagery and the ideas from the introduction. So you can see things like the drive to follow after the questions. You can see things like it's not genetic or a gift from above. I mentioned that in the introduction. So these are ways that you can create conclusion paragraphs. So keep in mind that conclusions do not include any new information. Instead, they're there to summarize or recap your own main ideas from the rest of your paper. The conclusion should restate the thesis statement in some sort of new way. It's not a direct copy of your thesis, but it's definitely mentioned in the conclusion. And then you kind of put the essay to bed. So you're going to make the reader feel glad they read your paper or thought-provoking. They're going to see that it's come to a clear end, and that needs to happen in the conclusion of your paper. So just to recap what we've gone over, remember that you need to find the right ingredients. When you're looking for source material, find reliable sources. When you build your sandwich for your sources, surround your source material with your own words and ideas. And then when you sandwich your essay, you're going to do that with a clear introductory paragraph and a conclusion paragraph. Things to keep in mind for this week: we do need you to read page 56 to 77 in the Longman Writer. We have week 7 discussion board questions to answer, and then the final draft of essay 3, the compare and contrast essay, is due by the end of the week. So that's Sunday, 11:59 p.m. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to send them my way. Otherwise, we will see you in the discussion board. Have a great week. Bye-bye.